Hello, everybody. Welcome again to another Tips from an Expert. You might have joined us last week on Friday when we talked a little bit about garden maintenance and harvesting your vegetables. And today we're turning around and we're going to learn about preserving your garden. We have two specialists with us today, and I am so excited to hear from them and take notes as I listen. Let's bring on our first specialist. Welcome. This is Renee. Hi, Renee.
Hi.
How are you?
I am well, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I seriously have my notepad and my pen ready to go. I'm taking notes. I'm gonna learn to can and preserve my food. Well, the food that my husband plants. We're a good team like that. So
there you go. Well, we love to talk about food preservation. So
I am eager to hear. We have another specialist with us as well. So let's meet Holly. Hi, Holly.
Hi, y'all.
How are you today?
Doing really well. Thanks.
Good. Well, we are going to get ready to dive in. Briefly before we get going, I'm going to make sure that we put the Iowa Concern toll-free number on the screen for everyone. And I'll do this again at the end. We know that many in our state right now are experiencing a level of concern and crisis higher than normal. It has been a year, guys. It has been 2020 has really Iowa Concern is free, available 24/7. You can call and talk to experts about whatever it is that is feeling like a little more than you might be able to handle on your own. And they have support and resources and just a really, really great resource. So again, this is Iowa Concern, free. They also have multiple languages available. So that is that. Okay, let's get going. Renee, you're starting us off, I believe.
I am, and so we're just going to talk about some basic information on home food preservation.
Woohoo, I'm excited. I'm clicking my pen. I'm ready to go.
So we can move right into the next slide. Here's the three main ways that people preserve food at home: canning, freezing, and dehydrating, and we're going to touch on all three of those. So we'll start with canning. Next slide, please. And you always want to start with the cleanest, freshest, highest quality produce. It's not going to get any better after you preserve it, the quality. So always be sure, just because it is a fairly time-consuming process, be sure to start with the highest quality, and that'll also be the highest in nutritional value as well. In the canning process, basically what we do is we heat the temperature of the jar and the product in the jar to a high enough temperature that will destroy any microorganisms, toxins, or spoilage enzymes. And so it's really critical that people do know how to do it correctly. And sometimes people think as long as the jar seals, they're okay. But a sealed jar doesn't necessarily mean it's safe if the procedure wasn't done correctly. So as far as how does that jar seal in the canning process, air is driven from the jar during this process, and the vacuum seal forms as the jar cools. Next slide, please. So here's the three ways that you can safely do canning. And so it will depend on the acidity of the food, which measure you're going to use. So on the left, we have pictured an example of a water bath canner. On the far right, we have pictured an example of a steam bath canner, and both of those are used for what we would call high acid foods. And then in the middle, we have the pressure canner, which is what we would use for low acid foods. Next slide, please. All right, so what are we talking about when we say acidic foods? So basically all fruits are considered to be acidic. An exception to that would be figs and pears and even tomatoes, although people think of them as being acid. We do need to add acid to them when we're canning. Sauerkraut is an example of food. Even though it starts as a vegetable, it becomes acidic during the fermentation process. And then sometimes we can vegetables, for example, when we're making salsa or when we're making pickles, but those are acidic as well because we add a large amount of acid to those foods, usually in the form of vinegar. All right, next slide. And so our next slide is going to show us the low acid foods, and here we have vegetables. And so that's really important right now because this is the time of year when people are canning those vegetables. So they need to realize that they are considered to be a low acid food, as are meats, poultry, seafood, soups, and other foods that would have a mixture of high and low acid. So spaghetti sauce is an example of that, where you have tomatoes you have possibly meat, and you might have other vegetables as well. So all of these foods you would need to safely can in a pressure canner. And our biggest concern here with this is the disease called botulism. It's a very serious foodborne illness, and botulism spores are hard to destroy in just a simple water bath canning procedure. So we're not concerned about it with the high acid foods because the botulism spores aren't going to survive in the acid environment. But when we have these low acid foods, that's where we have the concern about getting the water temperature actually even hotter than the boiling point. So these low acid foods, it is required that they are canned in a pressure canner. Okay, let's look at the next slide. So altitude is another thing that we need to consider, and sometimes people don't think about, but it is a food safety concern. Water actually boils at a lower temperature at a higher altitude. So if you live in a county in which the altitude is above 1,000 feet above sea level, and if you're canning when you're in that county, then you need to make adjustments. So for the water bath canning, we actually add 5 minutes to the processing time. So let's just say, for example, you were canning jam, and the recipe said that it would be a 10-minute processing time in a boiling water bath. Then if you live in one of the counties in which you are over 1,000 feet above sea level, your processing time would be 15 minutes in that boiling water bath. Now, if you're canning in a pressure canner, one of those low acid foods, then you need to adjust the pounds, not the pressure. So generally we would add 1 pound of pressure if you are between 1,001 and 2,000 feet above sea level. And so those would be the counties in Iowa that are over 1,000 feet. We would be between 1,001 and 2,000. And so you would add 1 pound. So for example, if you were canning a vegetable and the procedure said process it at 10 pounds pressure, then you would need to process it at 11 pounds. And that's if your pressure canner is a dial gauge. If your pressure canner is a weighted gauge, then it's not quite as precise as far as the numbers of pounds. You either go by 5, 10, or 15 pounds. So to accomplish 11 pounds, you would process at the 15 pounds of pressure in the weighted gauge pressure canner. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And here's our map of Iowa that actually shows our elevations and our altitude. So the shaded areas are at less than 1,000 feet above sea level. So if you are canning in any of those counties in the shaded areas, you don't need to do any altitude adjustment at all. But if you're in the unshaded areas and you are canning in the pressure canner or the water bath, you would need to make an adjustment. And so in the water bath, anyone canning in the unshaded areas, you will add 5 minutes to the processing time. In the pressure canner for low acid foods, you would add 1 pound of pressure to the processing time in those unshaded areas here in Iowa. All right, let's go ahead and look at the next slide. What are we talking about when we say processing times? Well, that is in the water bath, it's how much time is that product recommended to be in the water bath according to your tested recipe or your tested procedure. And then in the pressure canner, it's how many pounds of pressure for what amount of time for the low acid foods. And so we don't want to be winging it. We don't want to be guessing on these processing times. It's something that, for example, Holly and I, who are both home food preservers, we always look these up. We never memorize them. Every year when we do our canning, we always look these up at one of our tested sites. And so we are just recommending anyone listening to this that you get familiar with those tested sites for recipes, and you look up every year what would be the processing time. They're tested to be sure that the coldest part of the jar gets adequately heated. And of course, that will be affected by the jar size, the size of the food pieces, and even the canning liquid consistency. So there's a lot of things that we want to compare and look at when we're thinking about what is the correct processing time. And all of that will be spelled out in the tested recipes and procedures. Okay, next slide. Here's the water bath canner. And so these would be for those high acid foods or foods that we have acidified. And so you can see that we have a pretty large pot. It doesn't have to be that traditional blue, white speckled, rippled bottom water bath canner, but it needs to be something that is large enough that you can at least have then about 1 to 2 inches of water over the top of the jars, and then 1 to 2 inches of air space on the top of the water, because in the water bath canning, the water will be at a very vigorous boil. So you need space in the top of the stock pot or whatever it is that you're using for that to be able to boil. And the other thing that you need for water bath canning is you need some sort of a metal rack to have in the pan. So the one in the slide picture is one that fits right down into that rack. It can also be just a flat rack on the bottom. And usually you can purchase these if you're the pot that you're going to use for water bath canning. If it doesn't have a rack that goes with it, you can usually purchase these at various stores where canning supplies are sold. And then just a newer recommendation for water bath canning. Once the processing time is done, so let's say if you were doing that jam that we talked about earlier, and you're in one of those counties where we would adjust for altitude, so we had 15 minutes of processing time. We start the processing time when the water comes to a vigorous boil. We set the timer for 15 minutes. We turn the burner off when the 15 minutes has gone by. And then a newer recommendation is once we've turned that heat off, go ahead and remove the lid of the water bath canner, but let the jars sit for 5 more minutes for the contents to settle before you remove them from the water bath canner. All right, next slide. Now we'll move into pressure canners. Remember, we're going to use these for low acid foods. And I've already alluded to the fact that there's 2 types of pressure canners. There's the dial gauge. See, it has that gauge on top where you can specifically see what pounds of pressure that's at. And so the thing about the dial gauge is you would need to be sure that that is accurate. And so we do recommend that you have that tested annually. And several of our extension offices around the state do offer testing of the dial gauge. Then on the weighted gauge canner, you can see there's no dial. And so you can't see the exact pounds it's at, but that little piece that's in the middle there in the picture on top of the lid, that's the weight. And so there's 5, 10, and 15 pound weights. Now the great thing about the weighted gauge pressure canner is it is always accurate and there's no need for it to be tested. Okay, next slide. So let's just look here. Here are some unacceptable canning methods. And that first one there is the boiling water bath canning of low acid foods. And we really can't emphasize enough that that is a dangerous procedure, and it's one that could promote concerns with botulism, which is very serious. The next one is open kettle canning. This is an old-fashioned method of canning in which you heat the food, you put it in a hot jar, and then you just put the lids on it and seal it, and you don't do any processing. And so open kettle canning is never acceptable for any type of food anymore because we risk concerns with spoilage and even foodborne illness. And then what about sealing those jars of jams or jellies with paraffin? My grandma always did that, but that's no longer considered to be a safe way to seal jams and jellies. Actually, those have a tendency to come loose, and mold sometimes grows in those. And so to prevent mold growth, to prevent flavor loss, color changes, surface darkening, and even to protect the safety of jams and jellies, we don't recommend that you use paraffin to seal them. And of course, canning in a pressure canner is what is safe, but canning in a pressure cooker or an Instapot would not be safe. A pressure canner is large enough to hold 4-quart jars. And so a pressure cooker is actually not large enough to do that, and an Instapot would not be recommended for that either. Oven canning sounds so tempting, and especially this time of year when people have a lot of tomatoes to can, they're really seeking an easy way to do that. But oven canning is a dry heat process. It actually is very different than canning in boiling water, and so you don't get the same heat penetration into the center of the jar. The other thing that can happen with oven canning is that jars can explode. The microwave, we don't can in the microwave. Sometimes there are recipes that specifically will say that you could cook your jam in the microwave, or you could heat your pickling liquid in the microwave. But other than that, we wouldn't be using the microwave at all for canning, and you would only do that if your recipe specifically gave you guidelines on, for example, cooking your jam in the microwave. And then the last one we sort of chuckle about, that says dishwasher processing. Now the dishwasher does get hot, and you know what? If you put your jars in the dishwasher. They might even come out sealed, but remember, a sealed jar is not always a safe jar. And certainly we're not going to get the same heat treatment by putting them in a dishwasher. So we sure don't want people to do that. Let's look at our next slide. So again, processing times are always going to be based on our up-to-date tested recipes and procedures. And Holly's going to talk about those later in the presentation as well. Where can we get some of that information? And once you do remove the jars from the water bath or from the pressure canner, then you just leave them set for 12 to 24 hours. You don't worry about wiping them off. You don't worry about tightening the screw band. You don't worry about whether they are sealed or not. You might hear that popping sound as they cool, but let's not test to see if the jars are sealed until at least 12 hours have gone by. And then once 12 to 24 hours have gone by, then you can remove the screw bands, wash the jars, label them, and then all home preserved food, we recommend that you store it in a cool, dry, dark place and try to get it used up within about a year. All right, next slide. So what are some common canning mistakes? We've sort of alluded to some of these already. Using the wrong canner for the wrong product. Not adjusting for altitude. Overfilling the jars, because sometimes that will interfere with the sealing. Reusing canning lids. Canning lids are for one time only. The screw bands can be reused if they're not rusty or bent, but the lids themselves, what my mom called flats, those we only use once. And using cracked or chipped canning jars, that can interfere with sealing. If you don't have enough water in your boiling water bath canner, it might not be safely processed. Disturbing those jars, moving them or messing around with them instead of just letting them cool for 12 to 24 hours, that also can interfere with the seal. If you use inferior ingredients, produce that is not of the highest quality or maybe has some spoilage, your product may not be safe. And then using your own canning recipes. So people do like to be creative in the kitchen, and when you're cooking, that's okay, but not when you're canning. Next slide. So here's our best advice for canning. Always use a tested recipe. Don't use the electric multi-cookers for canning. Be aware of your altitude and make the adjustments if you need to. Set aside plenty of uninterrupted time so that you could really concentrate on what you're doing. Be sure you're using the most up-to-date procedures and practices and reliable resources. So that basically wraps up what we're talking about on canning, and I'm going to turn it over to Holly to talk about freezing, dehydrating, and reliable resources.
Thanks. Thanks, Renee. Yeah, let's discuss freezing as that home preservation method. And this is probably one of the most common types of preservation. We're probably freezing things and not even thinking that it's our preservation style. But when we do freeze our foods, there are microbes that are typically on our produce, meats, etc. And they're not killed when we freeze, but their growth is definitely limited, and actually it's stopped because the water in that food freezes, and so it's not available for those microbes to grow. When we look at doing our produce in the freezing, we want to make sure that we're washing it before refreezing it. And that helps to remove soil, which is also a source of some bacteria. But the one fruit that you don't want to wash before you freeze is blueberries. You do want to just freeze them as they come to you. And then once before you use them, when you bring them out of the freezer, that's when you want to wash those blueberries. The water on the outside actually tends to make the skin kind of tough. There's also enzymes that are in our produce, and they actually promote ripening. And so if they're not stopped, they will continue to ripen and actually spoil your produce even in the freezer. So most vegetables need to be blanched to stop those enzymes from continuing to ripen. And so blanching would be to either immerse them, the vegetables, in boiling water for a few minutes and then immediately cooling them. Or you can also blanch them in steam. But again, immediately cooling them down prior to freezing. Next slide. Foods that we're going to be freezing, we want to be very careful about how we're packaging them, because that is going to be the best way to protect them from that dry climate in the freezer. And you know, air is also an enemy when it comes to freezing our food. So we want to get as much air out of that package as possible. And so you want to make sure that it's moisture, vapor resistant. We want them durable because they might get, you know, pushed around a little bit in the freezer. Make sure that they're also leak proof. Something that's resistant to cracking and especially brittleness when they're in that cold temperature environment. We want them resistant to any oil or grease or water. We want them to be able to protect all that food. We don't want them to absorb flavors and odors that are also from the foods that are in the freezer. And something that's easy to seal and something that we can label, because the last thing we need to do is try to figure out what in the world is in that package. Next slide, please. The most common freezing mistakes is freezing inappropriate foods. For example, we're not going to probably freeze radishes or lettuce or kale, those kind of things, simply because they're such high water. We're not going to try freezing foods on a slow rate. We need to freeze them quick to be able to get those small ice crystals. Placing hot food in a freezer is one of the things that we don't want to do. I know we want to cool them down quickly, but placing it into that hot freezer is doing nothing but increasing the temperature inside that freezer cabinet. Freezing wet fruits or freezing wet vegetables, that's going to cause them to clump and cause that ice to be there. And again, the larger amount of ice, the less quality that those products are going to have when you really want to use them. If we skip the blanching, we can just skip that hard part. We really want to stop those enzymes, so we do need to blanch. Freezing fruit in a large clump as opposed to just putting them on maybe a cookie sheet and having them in a single layer in a smaller area so that it can freeze faster. Using the wrong containers, maybe using for long storage, you know, my mom would use old cottage cheese containers, and those are okay for a short amount of time, maybe a couple months, but for long-term storage, pulling them out after a year, the product inside is not going to be as high quality as when it went in. Overpacking any of those food containers or leaving it in the freezer too long are some things that we tend to unfortunately make mistakes of, and it causes us, you know, not only the amount of food that we had to put in there, but the time that was involved in getting them in the freezer. And so we want to make sure that we've got quality food when it comes time to thawing. Next slide. The best advice: do not overload your freezer with any unfrozen food. Just add only the amount that's going to freeze within about 24 hours. And that's usually 2 to 3 pounds of produce per cubic foot of storage space. So overloading that freezer is going to do nothing but slow down the freezing rate. So we want to freeze our foods quickly. Make sure that there's enough space between the food items so air can circulate. Get yourself a freezer thermometer and monitor that temperature. It should be about 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, use an appropriate packaging material to make sure that we can not have that freezer burn with our products. Pack them in serving sizes. You know, there's no reason to put in a 9-pound roast if it's just you and one other person at home. So just putting the foods into the freezer into the serving sizes to begin with. And please label those packages so that you know what you've got. So we're going to talk now just a little bit about dehydrating, and it is probably the least expensive preservation method. You can get a basic food dehydrator for about $40. It's easy. We just prep the food, put it in the dehydrator, and wait while we're doing other things. And so dehydrating time really is going to depend upon the food. It's going to depend upon the thickness of the food that's there, the temperature that you're putting it at, any water content of the food, and so on. It can take maybe 3 hours up to about 30 hours, depending upon the foods that you use. And luckily you can leave it and do other things. The other advantage is that the end product takes up so much less space for storage, and simply because it's taking out that moisture, and when it does that, it concentrates the flavor and the nutrition. Next slide. Two methods to safely dry foods at home would be that dehydrator, which is thermostatically controlled. They're typically electric, or you can use your oven, whether gas, electric, or convection oven. Sun or solar drying is another method of drying foods. However, it is less consistent since the low humidity is required, and there can also be exposure to some of the elements, bugs, etc., during outdoor drying. So it is not recommended. Next slide, please. The dehydrator does yield a better product. You can do it while it's raining outside or snowing outside. It doesn't matter. It's not weather dependent. It is very sanitary, and it is a quicker drying time simply because that air is circulating at a constant rate the entire time that your product is in there. Next slide. We'll talk about the oven drying. Typically, everybody may have an oven, so there's little or no investment needed. It does take, however, 2 to 3 times longer than if it was dried in the dehydrator. The product also is a little darker, probably a little more brittle and less flavorful than if it was dried in the dehydrator. With the process with the oven, you do have to rotate your food and turn it, so you need to be mindful about that. The other thing is the oven needs to go as low as 140 to about 145 degrees Fahrenheit. And some of the newer models for ovens don't go that low. And mine personally does not go below 170. So this is not one drying method that I can use at home. The other is if you have small pets or small children, you do need to keep the oven door open 2 to 4 inches to help with the air circulation. And so that too can kind of be a safety hazard if you've got pets or small children at home. So what can we dehydrate? It's a great way to start with some fruit. Start with some that you have. So apples are a great way. Cherries, grapes, peaches, pears, plums. You can even do some bananas, make some banana chips. Fruits with that higher moisture content don't dry real well. So those would be like your blackberries, cantaloupe, watermelon, honeydew, and some of your citrus types of fruit, oranges, lemons, etc. Fruit leathers are a great way, or those homemade fruit roll-ups are a great way to use up maybe some fruit that is, ripe but heading into overripe. And so all you need to do, or maybe they're bruised. So what you would do is just put them all into the blender, puree them, and then pour them onto a flat surface and put that in the dehydrator. They're great that way. Next slide. Vegetables too can be dehydrated. Beets, cabbage, carrots, garlic, corn, peas, peppers, onions, mushrooms, all of those. I just did some small grape tomatoes, just cut them in half and laid them on the dehydrator. I've also done sweet corn. I did not blanch it. I just cut it off the cob and went ahead and put that in the dehydrator. And they're great to just grab a handful of corn and put that in that stew in the middle of winter. It just tastes so fresh. Some of the things that aren't going to dry well, again, are like those high moisture. So your lettuce, radishes, etc. But don't forget about herbs. Herbs dry really well as also. So there's any herbs that you've got growing outside, go ahead and bring them in. Gather them when you're just in the morning after the dew kind of is dried off from the plant, and then go ahead and put them in the dehydrator. So use a tested recipe, just like Renee said. Please, please, please do not memorize anything when it comes to canning, or how many minutes, or how many tablespoons again of lemon juice do I need, etc. Just go to your recipe. And she's right. I go to the recipe every year. There were some significant changes that were made in 1994, as well as 2006, 2009, and 2015 when it comes to home food preservation. So please to make sure that you have a safe product. Make sure that the recipes that you are following are either from the National Center for Home Food Preservation. Also at ISU Extension Outreach, we also use the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning as well. Next slide. Please avoid those old recipes or cookbooks. They may not be updated. And like I said, we've had some updates within the last 5 years. So again, be wary of maybe the celebrity that has their fabulous dishwasher jam, or the out-of-date publication that came with the canner that your grandmother gave you. So just again, to be safe, make sure that we're using the most up-to-date recipes. Next slide. And our reliable resources. Preserve the Taste of Summer is our ISU Extension Outreach home food preservation resources. It includes the home food preservation publications, which can be downloaded for free from our website. It also includes some virtual home food preservation classes, and I've got some information about those upcoming online classes in the next few slides. The National Center, again, for Home Food Preservation at the University of Georgia conducts research in the area of food preservation. And they have a cookbook that's published, and it's called So Easy to Preserve. And the latest publication date for that with all the updates is 2014. The USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning is a great resource for people who are canning for the first time, or maybe for that experienced canner who just wants to improve their canning practices. And the information is based on research conducted by the National Center for Home Food Preservation, and it's in cooperation with USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Next slide. So here's our online food preservation classes. We've got our Food Preservation 101, and that is a class that just has an overview of just food preservation. And it's coming up this Thursday. We've got 2 sessions, one at 10 and one at 8 p.m. We also have one Thursday, September 10th, and that's at 7. We are also looking at providing more information on some timely topics for preservation. And so we've got one called Totally Tomatoes. So anything and everything you can think about regarding tomatoes. It reviews canning tomatoes using both the pressure canner and the water bath canning methods. And that's going to be offered in October 8 at 10 and again at 6 p.m. and then again on October 12th at 10 in the morning and or at 7 p.m. Next slide. We also have one on apples. The apples are going to be coming ripe here, and the orchards are going to be going full speed ahead. So it's called All About Apples, and that class is going to review canning, freezing, and drying apples. And so there's a couple dates there, October 22nd at 10 and at 6 p.m., and also on the 28th of October at 10 and at 7. And these online home food preservation courses are all free of charge, and registration can be done through the ISU Extension and Outreach website. Next slide. Sow, Grow, Eat, and Keep. We currently have that series. It kind of mixes our horticulture with also some food preservation. And so you may want to check that out. It helps to connect with nature. We want you to be able to grow and prepare your own food with that Sow, Grow, Eat, and Keep series. And so there's short videos that explore gardening, food prep, food preservation, and hopefully that'll get you started there at home. And now we have our Q&A.
Oh my goodness. My fingers hurt. I started typing my notes instead of writing because I couldn't keep up. Oh, that was really good, you guys. It wasn't just me too. We have Audra that was really excited about what you're saying. It looks like a friend that might know you said hi. Great job. So we have lots of questions that came up. I actually shared this on my personal page and hosted a watch party. So I have been adding all of those comments into our banner. So we're going to just jump into it. Again, any of our viewers right now, if you've got a question, or maybe you jumped in a little late and might have missed something and you're thinking, oh, I think they were talking about this, but I'm not sure. Throw it in the chat. In the comment section, we'll get to those Q&As. If you're watching this later after the live is over, still comment your questions. I will make sure to get that information, that question to Holly and Renee. We'll get you an answer. Are you guys, do you need a drink? Do you need a restroom break? You good? No, okay, we're gonna just move right into it. So first, I think it's really important that we get AnswerLine's information up there. Do one of you guys want to give a little more information on AnswerLine, this resource?
Sure. AnswerLine is manned Monday through Friday, 9 to noon, 1 to 4. And we've got some awesome experts there who can answer your question, whether it's how do I get this stain out of the collar to what can I do with all of this squash I've got. So they can help. So give them a call.
You also can email AnswerLine at answerline@iastate.edu. And so if it's not something that you actually need to talk to someone about, they are really good at getting back on emails very, very quickly. So sometimes, in fact, if you're in the waiting queue for a call, you'll get the email back even, quicker than you could the phone calls. So.
Perfect. The questions just keep coming in, guys. So AnswerLine's a perfect resource. And if you do have some question that comes up, canning or non-canning related, these guys know their stuff. I have used them before. I was going to make a recipe, but I wanted to purposely make it so that I could freeze it. And I was going, gosh, do I need more water or less, more liquid, less liquid? It was just one of those things. And it was honestly easier for me to call them than it was to try to Google it. And sometimes when you Google it, you find a blog and you have to read 20 minutes about, their grandma's dog before you get to the actual resource. So AnswerLine has been used more than once in my home. Okay. So some questions that we have. What does acidify tomatoes mean?
So I'll take that one. When we talk about acidifying tomatoes, people do think of tomatoes being acidic, but the variety, the weather, the soil, all of those things will affect. And so we know that for tomatoes to be safe, whether you're following the water bath procedure or whether you're following the pressure canning procedure, we need to acidify them. So you would go to one of the tested reliable resources that Holly shared, which could include our ISU publication that we have, which is on freezing and canning tomatoes. And you can download that for free, as Holly mentioned. And it will specifically tell you how much acid you would add to each jar of tomatoes that you're canning. And it will depend on what size the jar is, whether it's a pint jar or quart jar, how much you add. The two things that we recommend to use for acidifying is either bottled lemon juice, or you can purchase citric acid, which they sell right where they're selling other home food preservation products. So you need to go back to your tested procedure to see how much to add to each jar.
Perfect. And I will put that resource in the links so people can have a little easier access. All right. I think you guys covered this one, but we probably should reiterate. Can you can in the oven?
I'll take that one. The answer is no. One, the jars may crack, explode. The other thing is it's a dry heat and it's not a moist heat. And so even though the oven is 350, it doesn't mean the product is 350 degrees. So we do not want to can in the oven. I know it's a huge cavity and you're thinking, wow, I can get, a bazillion quarts in there, but we want to make sure that they're safe. And so we're not gonna can in the oven.
So it's a sorry, but this is for your own good. All right. And that, I have, my youngest is 4, and that if you have to leave the oven open was it dehydrating that you talked about that?
Right.
Yeah. So that's not canning, but that was definitely a big mental note of going, okay, it will be worth an investment to get a dehydrator and not have to worry about the dog or the 4-year-old, or honestly, even the 16-year-old. Sometimes he's not looking when he's walking by. It could be dangerous. All right. Another tomato question. Do I need to remove the skins off of my tomatoes? I'm assuming that's prior to canning or using them for preserving.
Maybe we'll just go back and forth, Holly. So
sure.
I would just say, it's not absolutely required, But if you look at any of the tested recipes and procedures, they are going to recommend it, simply because if you don't remove them, they are going to come off in the canning process, and they are going to be floating on the top of the jar. So it's just better to remove them before.
They'll just be a little prettier.
Mm-hmm.
I've had applesauce before too, where I think, either not all the core was taken out, and every once in a while you get that little bit in there. And my husband, he should be a cherry tester, because if anybody's going to find that pit, it will be him every time. I let him get the first bite always. Okay, so if we're talking about removing skins, what are some ways that we can do that for our tomatoes?
Yeah. You want to go ahead and wash your tomato, and you want to put a little X in the bottom of the tomato, kind of the opposite of where the stem was. Just a little X with a knife, and then put it in boiling water. In about 30 to 60 seconds, you're going to see that skin begin to split. And so then you want to pull them out and put them in that cold water, and those skins will just slide right off, and then you can core it.
And this seems like it's a science experiment almost. Like, it would be kind of interesting. Okay. Someone's had this comment that they found steam canners on sale. Can they use those?
So yes, this is actually newer that we've said that we do have tested procedures now, and we know that using a steam canner can be used pretty much interchangeably with the water bath canner. So the difference with the steam canner, in water bath canning, the jars are completely immersed in boiling water. In the steam canner, the bottom part that you're setting the jars, you put the rack in and then you set the jars into, you just have a fairly small amount of water in that, and then the part that goes over the top of the jar is basically empty. And so that's how that steam canner, device would look. And so we do know now that you can get, if you're following the tested procedure, you will get the center of the jar hot enough, so it is safe to use.
Was it, the way that you worded that, was it previously not safe to use?
Right. We used to teach that. We just didn't have the tested procedures for it at that time.
Gotcha. And now we do. That's interesting. All right. So what can I do to make my soft jelly firmer?
Well, there is, you can take, and you would need to take the soft or probably liquid jelly, about a cup at a time. You can actually go ahead and reprocess that with a little bit of pectin and water. But you need to do no more than 8 cups at a time on the stove, and then you can go ahead and reprocess that. But that is actually, with the So Easy to Preserve or the National Center for Home Food Preservation, you can ask that question, and they've got some specific instructions regarding that. So you can make it firmer.
So now my mind's thinking here. So there are times that you might mess up. I know my daughter added sugar at the wrong time or something, and so instead of a jam or a jelly, we ended up with a syrup. Again, I was not in charge of that because I am still very much learning how to do this. Yeah. But it seems like there can be ways that you can have a whoops and, possibly be able to fix that, which is good for people like me that haven't really gone very far in their preservation experiments.
Yeah.
And is that an AnswerLine thing, that if I am seeing a weird consistency or just something unexpected, that I could call AnswerLine and say, I made jam, it looks like this or whatever, and they're going to be able to point me in the right direction? They
really should. Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. I always like knowing who to go to for those.
Yeah.
Yes. And if it's a time when AnswerLine isn't open, like, for example, the National Center for Home Food Preservation has like a whole troubleshooting section. So you can kind of look up and, see the recommendations of what to do.
That is really nice. And I know for me, one thing that has become a teaching tool for my kids is really looking for that .edu when you're looking for a resource. So if you can't reach AnswerLine, or, it's a little time sensitive and it's after hours or whatever, when you are doing that Google search, look for those .edu or .org, those really, those resources that are coming from that research base, because that'll make the difference, let me tell you. All right, let's see what else. Can food be recanned if you don't have proper sealing that first time?
So I'll take that one. And yes, food can be recanned, but do keep in mind that you would need to, kind of start over. So let's just say, for example, if it was tomatoes and you had heated them, you were hot packing them. So you had heated them, then you put them in the hot jar, then you did your processing time, and you've let them sit for 12 hours and they didn't seal. Well, to redo that, you have to go all the way back to heating those tomatoes. So it's quite a lot of heat treatment, honestly, to do that. You can do that, but a couple of other things that you might want to consider is if the jar didn't seal, well, the easiest thing to do is just pop that jar in the fridge and plan to use it within, a
That's
week
what I was
or
thinking.
two.
You make spaghetti that night then if the sauce didn't.
Exactly,
the lid didn't
exactly.
seal.
Yes. Another thing you could do is you could transfer that into a freezer type container, and you could freeze those tomatoes. But you can recan. Just keep in mind that all that further heat treatment will definitely affect the quality of the product.
Interesting. And yeah, I would have thought about using it right away just because my mind went to spaghetti sauce and I love spaghetti. But I wouldn't have thought of, getting it in a freezer bag. Are there certain, and I was doing a lot of notes. So if I miss this, then this is just the reminder for Leah. Can I just use like a normal freezer bag, like a plastic bag, or do I need to get like the ones that pull out the air and more like heat seal the bag? I can't think of what those are called.
Like a food saver type of vacuum. Yeah, no, they're the freezer bags that are there. You sure can do that. Just making sure you try to get the air out.
Okay.
And so what we suggest is putting a straw on one end of that little zip thing and then forcing, either with a squeegee or your hands to force as much of air out. And then you can seal it up to the straw and try and get that air out.
If it's a liquid, I was just going to say, if it's a liquidy food, like say tomatoes, then you might want to choose a freezer container that is, is more solid. It's firmer, like a plastic container that says that it's designed for freezing.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Let's see. Did we do this one? I don't think we did this one. If I lose liquid during processing, should I replace it?
No, don't.
Okay.
Don't open the jar. Don't open the jar. Don't open the jar. Don't open the jar.
Okay.
No.
So what you're saying is don't open the jar.
Right. Yep. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
That's the easy answer then.
I mean, there may be, several reasons why lost liquid. I just did some tomatoes, and for some reason, one of my little pints was upside down when the processing time was over, and all the liquid was gone, and I had like a half a jar. So that just went immediately into the fridge. But I'm not really sure. It could have been, since it was tomatoes, maybe it was too ripe, or maybe it was underripe and there was too much air in that product. But don't open it to put
don't add the liquid
in there.
Okay.
No.
I'll remember that.
Sometimes if you overpack the jar, the product will expand during the heating process, and it pushes some of the liquid out of the jar. And so sometimes you'll have discoloration on the top of the product if you do lose some of the liquid, but that's not a food safety issue. So as Holly said, don't open it.
Don't open the jar. I'm going to get you a t-shirt, I think, that says that on it. All right. I am brand new to food preservation, so this person understands me. What are your words of wisdom? Anything, just any sage advice that you'd want to offer us newbies?
Well, go to one of these test sites. The National Center for Home Food Preservation is just probably one of the most frequently bookmarks that I go to. And so initially read up about food preservation, right? Read up about what are some of the general things that it tells you about food safety, about water bath canning, if you're going to dive into freezing, if you're going to dive into pressure canning, whatever. Read up some of the background information first before you just take out a recipe and get started. So you kind of know some of the basic guidelines for each of the procedures. And then Certainly, if you can join in on one of our Food Preservation 101s that we still have coming up. We have 2 this week. We have 1 in September. That would be a great background for you as well. And also our publications that you can access from the website. They give a lot of good kind of some of the basic information about, let's just say, for example, water bath canning. So if it's the publication on canning tomatoes, you're going to learn a little bit about water bath canning in that publication before it dives right into the procedure of actually canning tomatoes.
Oh, that's helpful. And I know I know we've done a lot, but in the comments, and I pulled up just for a second, I did put links to all of these resources that you guys have referenced. So that way, anybody watching it now or watching it later, you can come back and click those links, visit these sites and these resources. And, you know, it can, I can tell you as a new person to canning, it feels like a lot of information, but they're really user-friendly resources and sites that help. And again, AnswerLine, when all else fails, or when nothing fails and you just want to talk to somebody.
Yeah, absolutely.
They've got the answers. It's crazy. Sometimes I just want to call and ask them questions just to see if they always know. Okay, so I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it. This person has a recipe for canned salsa that's been handed down in the family. Can they still use it?
My advice would be to go to the tested recipe, and it may be the same. But there's a reason why we don't really promote your own recipe, and that's because the acidity. We want to make sure that that acid is there enough to be able to make sure that that food is going to be safe sitting on the shelf. So, Renee, would you have anything else that you would share with them?
No, same thing. I have a recipe from my mom, and I basically compared it to all the tested salsa recipes and then I chose the tested salsa recipe that was closest to the seasoning in my mom's, but I didn't follow my mom's. I followed the tested recipes. So, you know, when Holly was talking about acidity, things like the quantity of onion and the quantity of pepper, that affects the acidity of that product. So you want to be sure that you have everything in the right ratio, which you will with the tested recipes.
And that's such a good idea to just figure out which one is closest to this recipe that you love or that has been in your family and do that one. Yeah.
With that, if somebody really likes their corn salsa, just add the corn after you open the jar before you serve it.
Oh, yeah. But keep it on your shelf, canned, sealed, and then when you're wanting to eat it, add your corn in. Yes. Okay. I don't know why I didn't think of that on my own, but that is very smart. It's like you guys have done this for years, and you know, it's like this is your full-time job. It's just crazy. Let's see. How important is it to remove the bubbles before water bath canning?
So is this person, okay, Holly, I'm assuming that they're talking about removing the bubbles from the actual jar of product.
Let me see. This was my friend's question.
I'm going to assume the same.
Okay. And so that is a step that we recommend. So you fill your jar to the appropriate headspace, and then you do run a plastic knife or a plastic spatula or something like that around the edge of the jar to have the bubbles rise up. Now, you know what? If you're in the middle of this and all of a sudden you realize, oops, I forgot to do that for one jar, it's okay. But often when you do that, when the bubbles rise to the top, the volume of the product then actually goes down a little bit in the jar, so you can add a little bit more to that to get it up to the appropriate headspace. So it allows you to get a little bit more volume in the jar, plus the fact that we don't want to have the product be too low in the jar. You know, we do want it to be at about that headspace. So,
but if they forgot to remove the bubbles on a batch, they should be okay.
Right. As long as they had it pretty well up to the headspace. I mean, don't panic over that.
Okay. Whew. Texting my friend right now. So calm down. Okay. Oh, this is a good one. Is there any produce that I can't can? I can't can. Is there just anything that you're like, either no, you shouldn't do it, or it's not worth it? Do freezing or dehydrating? Holly's thinking.
Produce. So we're talking about lettuce, you know,
no,
there are things to can. Again,
I've seen like canned cucumbers, well, pickles, like asparagus. Like I'm trying to think of, not jams and jellies, which I've had pepper jelly. I don't know. Not the leafy greens though.
Well, if there's a tested procedure for it and a tested recipe from one of the sites, then you can do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
One that you will not see, you wouldn't see, for example, pumpkin butter. That's a product that you can buy commercially. You can buy commercial pumpkin butter, but because of the density of that, there's not a safe procedure for canning that at home. And just like you can buy, pureed pumpkin that you put in pumpkin pie. So there's no tested procedure for a pureed canned pumpkin product or canned squash.
Right.
You can cube those and pressure can them, but the density of that when you puree it and mash it and put it into the jar, there's just nothing for home food preservation that will guarantee that we get the center of that jar hot enough. So we wouldn't be doing that in home food preservation.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's just a couple that not going to happen. Okay. Can I freeze chopped onions so they're recipe ready? I think that means like you can thaw it really easy and throw it in or.
Absolutely.
Now I'm picturing like how when I cut up my onions, if I store them, like, if I cut up half of an onion to use and then I'm going to use the onion the next day, it can get kind of like watery in the fridge. Will it do that? Will it have more moisture after you thaw it then? That would make sense, right? Do you have to dry it off after you thaw it then?
No.
I might be overthinking this, guys.
Well, produce in general, when you freeze it, some liquid seeps out.
Yeah.
So you would have some loss of liquid, a little bit of loss of liquid. It's not nearly as much in something like onions, though, as it is in something like tomatoes that you freeze.
That would make sense. I always encourage my husband to watch these later in the evening. He does a lot of gardening and he does actually a lot of cooking, which I'm sure you're shocked after my last question. And he always goes, "Oh my gosh, Leah, I can't believe you asked that." So he's going to laugh at that one right there. Okay, so we had a 4-H related question. The question was like, what resources will 4-Hers need to know or use for 2021? I'm going to provide just a little bit of background for any viewers that we have a lot of 4-Hers that take jams or jellies, other types of foods to their county fair, and they meet with a judge, and they have to take a tested recipe when they're taking anything that's been preserved. And I know at county fairs that I've had in the area that I previously served, that there were some times that we unfortunately had to tell 4-Hers that they were not able to show this because it was not, it was like a family recipe that wasn't that tested recipe. So anything that 4-H families and 4-H members need to be kind of looking forward to, any changes, updates, anything like that?
One thing I would say is if you are doing your canning in a county that requires altitude adjustment, they need to be sure to do that, and then write that on their process that they did adjust for altitude, so that the judge definitely knows that they made that altitude adjustment. That would be one thing to be sure to do. And then, like you mentioned, Leah, they need to use one of those tested sites that we have already mentioned.
I'm going to put in the comments the Foods for Iowa 4-H Fairs. It's a quick reference guide, and it looks like it was last updated January of 2020. So that's pretty recently updated. And Shannon Coleman is author of this, who was on a previous Tips from an Expert, one of our food safety specialists. But yeah, that's another AnswerLine one too, though, that if my 4-H member wanted to make a recipe or can or something like that, that we could call AnswerLine and have that question. Is that? I'm correct there? Yeah.
Yeah. And that'd be great for the 4-Her to put that in their write-up too, is that they contacted AnswerLine. Or if the nutrition specialist in their area is offering like a food preservation 101 class or a workshop or something, we hope that we will be doing those in 2021. And so attending some of those is also a great way to learn, have fun, and the judges do really like to see that they, sought out those experiences and learning opportunities.
Yeah, judges love to hear what your process was and what you learned. So they would love if you called AnswerLine and learned something new. Absolutely. Okay, a couple more questions. So what's a good variety of apple if they're wanting to plant a tree for in years to come, fruit that they could then can, or if they're buying apples for producing applesauce? Are there any good, like the best varieties to use?
Well, there's some that are, more tart,
Mm-hmm.
like the Granny Smith are a little more tart, but I don't know. I don't think I've met an apple I didn't like.
Same. They're all good. They all
Yeah.
make great applesauce.
Yeah.
So it's probably just a preference.
Mhm.
And is it, again, I'm going to ask a newbie question here. If the apple, if I bite into that, cut it up, and it's a tart apple, is the applesauce going to be more tart then, as opposed to a
Yeah.
sweet? Okay.
Yeah. It
So
will be.
there's how you taste test the apple and you figure out what. There you go. Would that be the same then for, you talked about pumpkin butter, but apple butter? Is there a good
It's
variety
okay.
for apple butter?
Yes. Yes, you can.
We
You
can
can
we can apple butter. And is there a specific apple variety that you would say would be really good for apple butter?
Mm.
I am salivating talking about apple butter. So
There's a
it might
lot
be-
of apple varieties that are recommended for cooking.
Yeah.
And so any apple variety that's recommended for cooking, and, like Jonathan, McIntosh, there's so many different varieties that are, Cortland, there's so many different varieties that are good for cooking. They would be perfect for making apple butter.
Perfect. Okay. Can I freeze basil? So you talked about dehydrating our herbs, but what about freezing? Can we freeze it?
Absolutely. I go ahead and cut them up. Actually, put them in a little processor with water, and then I put it in ice cube trays. And then once those are frozen, then I pop them out and put them into freezer bags. And so then I can just pop a cube into the pasta or the whatever. Mm-hmm.
Now my mind's thinking, what else can we put in an ice cube tray? Like all
Any
herbs?
herb.
Any herbs. That's so smart.
Mm-hmm. And then
That's so smart.
the other way that you can do it is just whole.
Mhm.
And if you're going to put it in a freezer bag, sometimes just a little bit of oil, vegetable oil, in that would also help with the freezing. Get rid of that air out of that bag.
Well, and I've had basil cucumber flavored water. Uh-oh, we lost your light again, Renee. So now I'm thinking about those basil ice cubes. That might also be a little life hack for keeping that one. I'm going to type that in my notes. Okay, let's see. I think we had another question come in. Yes, we did. What size is a good water bath canner size for canning quarts?
So if you think you're going to have a fairly large supply of produce to can at once, you'd probably want to get kind of the standard water bath canner size will hold 7 or 8 quart jars. But the minimum that it would be able to hold and be called a water bath canner would be 4 quart jars, because remember, the processing time includes the time that it takes for the water to heat up and come to a boil, and then also to remain at a boil. And so the size of the canner will affect how quickly you can bring that to a boil. So kind of the standard size that'll hold 7 or 8 quart jars is about as big as what I have seen. If you have a smaller quantity that you don't have a huge garden, you don't plan on canning more than, say, 4 quart jars at a time, then you could get one that's a little bit smaller, but it still has to be tall enough, big enough to hold 4 quart jars, and tall enough that you'll have that inch or two of water above the jar and an inch or two of airspace above the water.
There you go. Okay, I think we're nearing the end of questions. I am going to put up our answer line again. And again, there is a link in the comments. In the link, you'll find not only the phone number that you can call toll free during the hours that they list, but you can also find other ways to reach them, like email. Again, in the comment section, there are quite a few different links to the resources that we talked about, I'm like taking credit now for that we talked about during this. And again, we really encourage you to look at those resources, get a feel for them, and then reach out to AnswerLine if you are finding that your question hasn't quite been answered. And we are going to, I think we'll call it good on the Q&A. I haven't seen any new ones come in. But if you are watching this after the live has ended, feel free to still comment your question or send us a message, and I will make sure to get those questions to Holly and Renee and then get back to you with an answer or a resource that provides you an answer. So let's get our last slide or another slide up that has your guys' contact information. So again, this is Renee and Holly, and they are our nutrition and wellness specialists. Here are their email addresses that you can access them with if you'd like to follow up. Again, there's AnswerLine, the phone number, and then some social media pages to follow if you don't already. Our main extension pages, as well as you'll see AnswerLine has a page on Facebook that you can follow, get some information from them. Thank you guys so much for joining us. I seriously learned, I can't even tell you how much I learned. And I love that there are so many more ways that I can continue learning with your Food Preservation 101 workshops. And that's in the links, as well as all these amazing resources and other upcoming workshops. And I certainly hope that we're getting to see more of those workshops coming up, because I know there's a lot in our community that have, all throughout Iowa, that have attended these in the past. And from what I'm learning, it's important to keep attending them, because we learn more and we can do better every time that we get that new information. Any last parting words you want to send our viewers off with?
Happy canning.
Absolutely. Happy canning. I'm putting our Iowa Concern hotline up one more time before we say goodbye. Just as a reminder, this is a free 24/7 resource. When you are feeling like you're having a little more in your life than you feel like you can handle on your own, please call Iowa Concern, free 24/7. There are multiple language interpretations available, and there are people that can help you. Whatever you are dealing with right now, they can help. So please reach out. We are so thankful again, Holly and Renee. I hope you guys have a great day. And I am going to go home and I'm going to open up some of those links and I'm going to make a game plan. I'm going to can something. It's going to happen. I will call both of you, but it will happen. All right, guys, have a good day.
Thanks. You too, Leah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.